This is day 2 of B-Sides. With that, we're going to have another amazing speaker with us that's going to give us the road to hell is paved with bad passwords. The fabulous Chris, take it away.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, B-Sides, and it's going to be a pleasure to share this particular incident management event with all of you. It's going to give you a bit of an insight on what happens when an actual embassy gets hacked by a cyber terrorist group, and some of the ins and outs of what happens with various types of diplomacy and when law enforcement does not apply in certain situations. Now, to give you a bit of an introduction, what had happened was in 2014 in The Hague, which is the business capital and government capital mainly of the Netherlands. It is a very diplomatic city. That's where the International Criminal Court of Justice is, and a lot of embassies around the world. So it's a very unique city in and of itself. And what had happened was it started with a series of attacks, starting with the Saudi Arabian embassy. It then spread over to over 20 different embassies, affecting them as well. Because law enforcement, regular law enforcement, does not apply with diplomatic issues, it also involved the Netherlands Diplomatic Police or Corps. And because of the severity of the situation, the National Terrorism Special Unit also had to get involved. There were 3 separate law enforcement reports, and it got to the point where the Saudi Arabian embassy of The Hague actually had to put a disclaimer on their website, as did several other embassies, because of what was going on. So, to get started, there were 4 major incidents that occurred with the entire event. And it began with unauthorized access into the email account, the actual business back-end email account of the Saudi Arabian embassy. And these things are important because you might have your public email that people can email an embassy to ask questions and so forth, but on the back channels you've got a different set of email accounts so that they go, say, to the ambassador's secretary directly and so forth. In addition, there was a very interesting rootkit that was discovered with one of my folks that I brought in, who was a forensics person who sniffed the network and found a rootkit. And what was interesting was the extortion attempt that ISIS attempted was all the way up to $50 million. And it reminded me very much of that comedy kind of spy movie, right? Where it's like, yes, $50 million, right? But what was even more unusual was the amount of lives that were put at risk at this particular event. So it wasn't just someone who was sending some nasty emails. There were actually valid threats to kill a lot of people. Actually, over 400 people's lives were unfortunately dangling in the crossfire. So this was timeline number 1 for half of the major incidents. Now, when you're in an embassy, local laws do not count. That is the sovereign property of that particular country. And so basically the ambassador has all the say when it deals with anything that occurs at the embassy. It is not, say, a local police. It does not matter at all. They have 0 jurisdiction, and I want to stress that. Absolutely 0 jurisdiction. But the only thing that the diplomatic police can do is try to aid in various law enforcement conversations. But then again, they don't have jurisdiction over an embassy either. Now, one of the reasons why I was chosen for this very interesting incident was because at the time I headed the information protection group, also the network and security operations for the Aramco family, as well as being responsible for the IT, IoT, and ICS systems around EMEA and Latin America. And they pulled me in because I had a lot of experience as well with forensics, and we had already had our chain of custody checked actually by the diplomatic police at our company to make sure that any evidence beforehand, whatever we collected, if we had to use for a criminal matter, we actually followed all of the local laws to be able to go ahead and hand off evidence. So I have a lot of experience in forensics. And I am not a law enforcement person, but dealing with digital security and knowing that there can be various criminal events that happen, I always establish relationships with various law enforcement so that when and if, and it's usually when, certain things occur, that I can go ahead and call up various parties to get assistance and make sure that I know where I need to go to the, say, next hop and so forth. So these types of things are quite important to have in advance before any sort of incident occurs, as well as I do want to stress some sort of chain of custody or understanding that whatever evidence you collect in an incident, whether it be for something like a diplomatic issue or regular business issue, you have a full understanding of so that you can hand this off, because there's no use letting criminals get away with bad stuff. I also have a lot of experience dealing with ministers, ambassadors, and heads of state as well. So I was able to communicate very technical matters because I was a technical executive, all the way up to ambassadors and heads of state and ministers. So I could speak their language as much as possible, because without that, they do not understand the severity, they do not understand what they need to do, and a lot of times they need us to give them advice. And if we cannot communicate with them, then it's just like speaking some weird language that they will never understand. And we cannot show them a packet capture at all. Now, in addition to this, one of the challenges when you're dealing with an embassy is you have to deal with geopolitics. And at the time, the relationship between the Netherlands and Saudi Arabia was extremely strained. As a matter of fact, shortly before this event, Saudi Arabia canceled all contracts for Dutch companies and basically kicked out most of the Dutch people out of Saudi Arabia who were working as contractors, because there was something that happened, and I'm not going to go into detail because that's not my job. But because I am a US citizen, they trusted me a lot more, as well as I was already trusted within the Aramco family to handle these particular matters. And that's one of the other reasons why I was actually chosen to lead this investigation and do all of the negotiations. So it first starts out with, I felt so bad as well. I was trying to eat lunch, and I rarely ever got to sit down and eat lunch. And I'm sitting there and I'm eating like a spinach sandwich, and a big guy comes up to me in a suit and says, "You need to come with me." And I'm like, uh-oh, that means something bad's happened. Or maybe I'm getting fired. Who knows, man? I swear to God, I was not mining Bitcoins on the network, maybe. So I walk off. I probably had spinach in my, I did have spinach between my teeth because I had to be rushed off. And I asked the gentleman what's going on, and he goes, I'm not at that level to discuss that with you. I don't know. So I was pulled into a room, and I was told, we need to get you to the embassy as soon as possible. And when they described a little bit of what was going on, I said, hey, I need to get my forensics person to accompany me because there's probably going to be some sort of evidence and things that we need to collect as soon as possible. Because when you have an incident, you need to then figure out what's going on and then try to contain that as much as possible. Now, here's where it started getting very strange, because this was a very strange event to me. It was kind of mind-blowing. So the official business email account for the Saudi Arabian embassy in The Hague was using a residential ISP line, not a commercial line, and had no security except it had a password that was 123456. Yay, right? That's everybody's favorite password, right? There's nothing like using that for official embassy business. Cool, right? So that was a bit unfortunate, and what was even more unfortunate was the IT person who was there at the embassy. It was his second day. He had no security experience, and the person before him gave him zero handover, as in nothing, and they could not get a hold of the former person at all. So here this guy's sweating bullets. He has no idea what to do. And he's like, and I'm like, okay, we're gonna, chillax, because he was definitely panicking. And one of the things that the initial attack occurred was the attacker had intercepted some emails, seeing that somebody wanted a visa, and started sending back communications as if it was the ambassador's secretary. Because the way that it was set up was there was only one person that could read the official business emails, and only one system that was supposed to be set up that way, and that was only the ambassador's secretary, because that's the most trusted person within the embassy. And they have to be, because they know everything that's going on. very intimately. And what was a little odd was there was some attempts to ruin the reputation of His Royal Highness Prince Mohammed bin Nawaf bin Abdulaziz, which was at the time the ambassador to the United Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And I cannot show you those emails, but it was initially implied that him and another Saudi national who was married was having some sort of affair, which was absolutely not true. And so there was multiple things going on with this incident. And it was a little bit personal the way it was done as well, which we started seeing and going, hey, what kind of profile would the attacker be? Because they're using certain techniques, not at the time very high-end techniques, and looking to damage reputation, not only to the country of Saudi Arabia, but to certain key individuals as well. So the first extortion attempt was when a rather controversial figure was sent an email stating, hey, if you want this visa, can you just send 200 euro over to a MoneyGram account and we will expedite your visa? Well, the funny thing is the Saudi Arabian embassy had stopped issuing visas about 2 years previous, but that wasn't, not everybody knew that at the time, but they did not handle visas whatsoever. And the MoneyGram thing was rather suspicious. So this is one of the things that set it off, because it was coming from supposedly the ambassador's secretary. And the good doctor who got the email contacted the ambassador himself and said, hey, what's going on with your secretary? Because MoneyGram account seems a little strange of a way to get my visa, right? So luckily she could recognize that MoneyGram was not the usual way to pay for a visa. So that was kind of good. So it started kind of low end, and that seemed cool at the time. And what we did was, because I was unable to have full access to all of their network, because I am not a citizen of Saudi Arabia, so I have to listen to what the ambassador said, we then tried to contain everything and changed, obviously, the password from 123456, and advised some recommendation strategies to move them off of a residential line and various other bits to try to secure them a lot better. And so we thought everything was over and done and dusted, and then I go to have lunch again 2 weeks later, and then I get the same very large gentleman in a suit coming to me again and saying, there is another issue, please come with me immediately. I'm like, oh no, please don't let it be the embassy again. And guess what? It was the embassy again. So I really do liken it like space herpes, because that's basically what it felt like. At the time, because we were not able, or I was not able to gain access to all of the systems to look through them myself, unfortunately the attacker still had access to the email system, even though passwords were changed, everything like that. And more emails went out, and the amount started going up. And the diplomatic corps for the Netherlands was trying to be helpful, even though they were not asked to intervene whatsoever by the ambassador. And they were trying to be proactive, and unfortunately, they made matters extremely bad. They're very good people. I've still got friends with them, but sometimes when you intervene in certain matters and you don't know the entire picture, you can make matters worse, and that's just life, right? So the second extortion attempt went out to GCC member states, so that's basically part of the Middle East. And Qatar and Oman were very nice. They actually gathered evidence from their embassy to hand off to me, which was quite unusual because, again, I'm not a national of those countries. But they were trying to figure out what was going on, keep things contained, didn't want more damage to the reputation of Saudi Arabia or themselves. So they were extremely cooperative. And the attacker, using the embassy email, went ahead and, I wonder if this works, signed it with Embassy, ISIS, right? Isn't that cool? right? So you know exactly who it is. And that's nice of them, right? You know, save many lives. Give us 25 grand from each of the different embassies that they had sent this email to. Still using the Saudi Arabian embassy business email account. So, you know, it's a friendly email, right? So what had happened was the diplomatic police, or diplomatic corps, they had sent out a warning to the back end other embassies all around The Hague saying, hey, we've heard about these extortion attempts. And if you happen to get any of these emails, go ahead and contact us and we'll try to help you out. But the problem was, because the attacker was still in the email, and they got copied in, and the diplomatic corps did not use BCC, they used CC. The attackers sent back an email and started having a bit of fun. Let's put it this way. So it's not like the clearest here, but basically they said, hey, thank you so much. Now that we have your attention, this is fantastic. And all of these accounts. So we're going to start raising the extortion attempt up. And that's what they started doing. So the third extortion attempt started going up, and it started getting more and more personal, which was very interesting. So the perpetrator sent to the ambassador's secretary's personal Gmail account and sent an extortion attempt for $35 million. So it goes from 200 to 25,000 from a bunch of embassies to 35 million. The secretary, because it had involved her personal email account, she started getting scared, as you would, as I would, right? Thinking, oh my goodness, they're in my stuff too, right? So she went to report the matter to the local police. However, on the behest of the ambassador and for obvious purposes, we requested the local police to not finalize the report and to handle the matter privately. And this was to the point where the Netherlands Special Intervention Unit for Terrorism was called in because of the situation. I've got a bit of a cold, so I'm trying to keep my voice as much as possible. So what started happening was they sent another extortion email, and they said, hey, listen. And they sent this to all the embassies. There's going to be this Saudi National Day where over 400 dignitaries are invited to. And they're not just VIPs, they're VVIPs. So there's Dutch royalty, there's the ambassador from Japan to the Netherlands, the ambassador from the United States, so on and so forth. So their spouses, the very, 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 very important people in the world, right? Yes, 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 yes. And the Kurhaus is a national landmark in the Netherlands off of this beach called Scheveningen. It is where all of the wealthy people used to stay before they took cruises around the world back in the day, before airplanes were very big, because there's a big port there. And so this started to get extremely serious because it now involved over 400 people's lives that were being directly threatened, and a national landmark in the Netherlands. And between this time, the time frame now was getting up to almost 2 months. And at this point in time, although it was not publicly known, the Dutch National Terrorism Police and the Diplomatic Corps decided to basically partially shut down part of the embassy quarter of The Hague and assign all sorts of plainclothes and uniformed, highly armed, various type of military and so forth, all around the embassy quarter. And this was very interesting because I was also briefed that they had found my name on a list for ISIS, which was very interesting to get a briefing for that, right? And now, here's where I think it gets even stranger, and I'll never understand this one. So I used to go to this pub called Sherlock's Pub that was voted the best British pub in the Netherlands, in The Hague. And it was right by my house at the time. and all of a sudden, there were three cultural attachés from the Turkish embassy. And they would sit there, and they would sip tea because they did not drink, and they asked me for English lessons, even though they spoke English. So this was a little strange. And it was at this time that also the Dutch assigned me people to keep an eye on me because I was also on this list, and they thought it was quite unusual that the Turkish embassy had basically assigned 3 intel agents to get English lessons. I still have, it was probably the funniest, weirdest attempt at spies to do anything I've ever seen in my entire life. And basically this went on for about 2.5 weeks. The staff at the pub would keep them company while contacting the Dutch to tell them exactly when they arrived, and also I would be notified, and then I would be watched during the meetings to try to get information about what was going on. Now, towards the end of their attempts to get English lessons, I was given a very unusual gift, and I still have it because it was thoroughly checked. It's a rather personal gift. One of them gave me a set of prayer beads, which is not something that you would typically give somebody if you don't know them rather well and you're not Muslim. So this was thoroughly checked to make sure that there was nothing extra special in it. But I still like to keep it around to remind me of the most comedic series of super secret squirrel Turkish agents I've ever run into in my entire life, right? So one of the problems was the primary suspect had diplomatic immunity, and the perpetrator was a Saudi national who was an embassy employee and used that diplomatic immunity to his or her advantage. And it got even kind of weirder because the ambassador and the secretary and myself had suspected that particular individual. So one evening after the embassy had officially closed and that individual had actually left, it was only the ambassador and myself with his protection around the building, and him and I actually got on our hands and knees looking underneath desks for various passwords to try to get into the suspect's account. And I've never seen an ambassador get on his hands and knees with dusty stuff trying to look for stuff. But that was actually how severe the situation was and what type of damage could be done. Because obviously the Saudi Arabian embassy did not want to be associated with an ISIS agent who was threatening to kill over 400 people. And that was very, very bad. So we finally found various things and collected a lot of evidence. And when I was further investigating the situation, I was able to trace one of the hops directly to the neighborhood of where the suspect lived in The Hague. Now, at this time, the ambassador also did something very unusual. He allowed me to take evidence back to my home to investigate. And within about 30 minutes, I found that the way that the perpetrator was still on the back end of the email system, and a forwarder, because I could not see that from what they had shown me in the embassy. And so we went ahead and shut that down immediately. So it took me, about 15 minutes and a half a glass of wine to try to relax, right? But one of the problems is when you're dealing with somebody with diplomatic immunity, they're outside law, so they can only be prosecuted generally by their own countries, unless there is some sort of egregious thing. But the way that this was being handled, and obviously, or most likely I should say, the Netherlands wanted to work with the Saudi Arabians as much as possible in a friendly relationship to try to get their contracts back and their relationship back for business relationships. So diplomatic immunity, it can be a very, very tricky thing. Now, towards the end of this, we did not pay any sort of extortion whatsoever. There was no money paid, and there was no promise of money. I strung along the perpetrator as much as possible until basically we could gather enough evidence to pinpoint that it was actually that particular person. Now, one of the problems as well is not only with diplomatic immunity, but people who are assigned to embassies, there's a lot of, let's say, family favors or people that come from certain families that end up getting these types of jobs. And that's just the way it is in most countries, even in the United States, right? So you couldn't just send this particular individual back. There were certain politics dealing with this type of thing. So instead it was decided to reassign this particular person to an extremely dangerous location very quickly. And unfortunately, shortly after this person's arrival, there was just an unexpected surprise car bomb, which took care of the entire problem. So the end result was I ended up being invited to the farewell dinner of the Saudi Arabian ambassadors, and what they had done was rented the Rijksmuseum to have a private dinner in front of the most famous piece of art in the Netherlands called The Night Watchman in English. It's so important to Dutch culture that inside the Constitution, the painting cannot be owned by a non-Dutch person. So it's the absolute most famous one. It's by Rembrandt, and it is actually huge, really big. It's nothing like the Mona Lisa that's about yay big, right? And so at the farewell dinner, I was honored and given some gifts and a card and so forth, and got to wine and dine with some very high-end people. Unfortunately, I was feeling a bit ill that night, so I could not have the fancy schmancy wine, which was a bit of a shame. I could just like smell it and go, I wish I could drink the fancy schmancy wine. Oh no. But I got a very nice card from the ambassador and a few dignified high fives from some of the other country ambassadors that were more directly affected as well. So that was kind of nice. And I learned a few lessons out of this whole thing. And one of the things is, and I think most of us are aware of this now when we talk about, say, cyber warfare, election manipulation, all this type of stuff, is that geopolitics now play a huge part in cybersecurity, good or bad, right? And people can die if something goes wrong. It isn't just, hey, can somebody hack a insulin pump? Well, it's also, not only critical infrastructure, but what if you have a cyber terrorist who's actually using this type of methodology? And that's not a very good thing whatsoever. Another thing, if you ever accept a gift from a foreign agent, make sure it gets thoroughly checked. And don't take it home first, which I did not. So never accept gifts from a foreign agent, because you never know what they'll contain. Another thing is, at the time I had a partner, and I did not tell that partner, because I did not want to scare them, that I was on a high value kidnap list for ISIS. I was in the top 10 list. So I chose not to stress out that person, even though people were, assigned at a distance away from me and things of that nature. So sometimes it might be best to tell your family a little bit, because they obviously they're one hop away from you, might be at risk. So that was a bit of a mistake. Whoops. Another thing is, when you're in any sort of crisis, the best thing you can do is absolutely don't panic. Just like the towel and the book says, do not panic, because that is the absolute worst thing. You will only make matters worse. Try to take as many deep breaths as possible, and just know that tomorrow will come, and you do not have to panic today, or tomorrow might not come. So that's a very important matter to keep in mind. Now, I tried to keep time for questions, because I like questions. And I wanted to give a big shout out to Lana, who made up the title of this particular talk, and also Bryson Bort and Chrissy Morgan, who checked out the slides to make sure they actually worked, which is quite nice. So if you would like to ask any questions, please ask away, because I love to answer questions. I got one over here. I'll try to remember to repeat the question.
So that one person, was he working alone?
No.
Was he working
No.
with those 3 Turkish people?
Possibly, and another country as well. And inadvertently, he did not know he was working with another country as well. And that's where the malware came from.
And so did anything happen to the 3 Turkish spies?
So what happened with the 3 Turkish spies was after their attempts with the English lessons and things like that, they suddenly disappeared, and I was told that they were no longer in the country. Question there?
So I'm assuming that you didn't have any of the emails translated for your slides. So I'm just wondering, it seems curious to me that they would be threatening Arabic countries from a presumably Arabic organization in English.
So even though the embassies are in The Hague, most of the business languages are either French or English. And so all the emails were actually in English.
Thanks for the cool talk. 2 questions. One should be easy. So the suspect wasn't actually working with ISIS.
The suspect wasn't actually, the suspect was working with ISIS.
Oh, they were? So
Yes.
it was for real. Okay.
Yes.
And then
Absolutely for real.
and then the way you got involved, so this is because you worked for Aramco?
Yes.
And so that was just considered part of your job duties, or this was like a separate thing that you got? I mean, it's not my business maybe, but that's what I was trying to figure out, the business relationship as to, how they would rope you in.
So the business relationship between Aramco and, say, a Saudi Arabian embassy is very simple. Saudi Aramco is a national oil company that is also part of the government itself. So if, for example, there was not a qualified person to be able to handle the event, I was pulled in to start setting things up. And then they relied on me so heavily because I was speaking with the ambassador for hours every day and coordinating everything, and with legal counsel and with everyone basically. They decided just to have me take on the entire event.
I have 2 quick questions. First, was anybody else injured in the car bomb?
Was anybody else injured in the car bomb? Not that I'm aware of.
That's good. Second, the previous sysadmin, did you ever get a hold of him, or was he involved?
The previous sysadmin, they did eventually get a hold of him, but he was not involved in this incident. But I do believe he got a stern talking to about why the password was 123456, right?
You didn't go into the role of the rootkit at all.
So the role of the rootkit, I've decided to keep that because that's a bit more saucy. I'll be doing a DEF CON Sky Talks that will be describing that will not be filmed, and I'll be revealing what country was actually behind that as a helper for the ISIS agent. Question here?
Do you have the time for that Sky Talks?
Yes, the time for the Sky Talks is Friday at 1700 or 5 p.m. There's got to be more questions.
So your name was on the list?
Yes.
Do you know
my
if
name
it's
was.
still on the list?
So my name was on the list. As far as I'm aware, my name is not on the list anymore. And luckily, what used to be ISIS or Daesh, I prefer to call them, they basically disintegrated. And so that's a very good thing for me, as well as a lot of other people, right? Because we don't like bad people like that.
And do you reconsider or do additional things when you do travel overseas now?
So do I consider additional things when I travel overseas? Yes, absolutely I do. And so I keep an eye on myself. If I think that someone is tailing me, watching me, whatever, I notify various authorities. I try to take pictures of the individuals. I also separate my communications and do a lot of other things to try to keep myself as safe as possible, basically.
I'm glad you're giving the Sky Talk. I was kind of surprised as this went on that this wasn't an underground or Sky Talk. So is this the first time this has been discussed, or is it out there in the public, been disclosed otherwise?
So is this the first time this has been discussed or out in the public otherwise? A year ago I wrote a bit of an article about it, but I did not discuss much, except using the example of, hey, you shouldn't have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 password on an embassy, right? Because I was actually expecting some kind of like, you know, super secret squirrel blood sample DNA, you know, rundown to be able to get access to this type of stuff. And that was absolutely not the case, which was also quite unusual because I'm not sure if most of you are aware, but many times an embassy will also be an intelligence gathering capability. And so here you've got a business network and an intelligence gathering network, and you have a password of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So my mind was blown how on earth that would happen. In addition, they didn't have any antivirus. They only relied on Windows Essentials. Yeah, right? Yeah, it was great. We gotta have more questions. I'll have plenty of time for questions. I can do a song and dance. I can't really do a song and dance.
Any comment about the role of Saudi intelligence in all of this?
Any involvement of the Saudi intelligence apparatus involved in this? When it was determined that luckily they had segmented their network and the intelligence collection portion was not affected, they decided to keep that separate and allow me to do everything else, because unfortunately it's only been 1 year since Saudi Arabia has actually had an official computer emergency response team, and their apparatus for dealing with this type of stuff was not very good. As a matter of fact, in the book that I published, I noted that the Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs, up until April of this year, their secured email system was actually, for a TLS certificate, was using a Cisco demo certificate, which is just like a default credential. Because, yeah, I see shaking heads, because that's not particularly cool, right? For an intelligence agency, you don't particularly want that, right? So they've been trying. They've been trying. You gotta have more questions. What's the weather like in the Netherlands? Hey, with global warming, it's getting warmer.
Hi, thank you for the excellent speech. I'm wondering about the level of sophistication in regards to cybercrime and terrorism. Do you think that it's is it a high-level threat, or is it dormant, or yeah?
So the question is, do I think that there's a certain level of sophistication when it comes to these types of cyber terrorist type of groups, or when they're handling this type of thing? And the answer is not usually. So in the case of ISIS, they had attempted to hire basically hackers, and they went as far as putting an ad in one of the newspapers in India saying, basically, we're ISIS and we're looking for hackers. So I would say not typically. There have been a few people around, like the Cyber Caliphate, and a couple of people from the Syrian Electronic Army who were pretty decent. A couple of those people got droned. But what we found was that in order to have, for them to have a higher level of sophistication, they were actually being helped by another nation that they were not aware was actually assisting them. So, yeah. I see another question. I saw one back here, too.
So this ended up being an inside job, but it seems like it would be perfectly capable for someone on a remote side being able to do that. Was that a concern or fear?
It said, although this was an inside job, anyone could have done this remotely. And it was a concern and fear, so we had to follow a lot of different hops and make sure, so where one email had come from different hops and gone through various proxies, but ultimately the perpetrator had made a bit of an oopsie. And that's how we found out I could trace him or her back to the neighborhood that they lived in. But we were running all over the place going, hey, we're going to need court orders to get logs from, say, the Netherlands themselves to see the ingress-egress traffic at the national level. Then we were trying to contact other countries as well using diplomatic means because we did not really want to have this in the court system at the time. And so we were contacting, for example, India, where there was a hop, Russia, where there was a hop, Romania, where there was a hop, and so forth. Russia and India did not respond back. Russia just laughed at us. So, you know, what can you do? Because some of the emails ended up for some of the other extortion attempts. When they could no longer access the embassy email account itself, they had set up a Yandex account. So that the Russians just laughed. But we tried our best to use diplomatic means. And I saw a question back here.
Yeah, thanks. I have a couple questions. The first one might be dumb if I missed it. The suspect, was this like a Dutch employee of the embassy, or this was a Saudi national?
So was the suspect a Dutch national or a Saudi national? The suspect was a Saudi national.
Okay. And you were saying that you were living in The Hague at the time. Was that because of your Aramco responsibilities?
Yes. So I was, my main office was actually in The Hague because I preferred to live in The Hague than in Saudi Arabia.
I see. Is that, that leads me kind of to my next question. Is that typical for like expats, like non-Saudis that work for Aramco?
Is that typical for Saudis that don't? No, it is not. But I was a bit of a special case. I was the one that they called in after the 2012 attacks to set up all of their security and hire the actual security teams and contain things and so forth. So they gave me a lot of leeway. And at the time, I believe I was the highest ranking Western woman in the Aramco family as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
So if you were to make the payment, how would you have made it? And how did they determine exactly the amounts associated with it? Because it seems like they escalated up. Any comments on that?
So how would we have paid the extortion and basically the comical way that it rose from $200 to $50 million? Most likely, if we had had to pay, it would have been in currency and in metals. And why it got so big, quite frankly, the perpetrator wasn't very smart. So, you know, yes, that's all I can say. See another question?
When the ransom values were lower, was consideration given to just paying them?
So when the ransom values were lower, was there consideration paying them? No, there was not consideration paying for them because the Saudi Arabian embassy did not want to be in the habit of paying terrorists. And that was one of their big beefs with Qatar because there was some royals that were kidnapped, a big group, when they were out on a hunting trip. And Qatar paid a ransom to get them back. And that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of very bad relations between Qatar and Saudi Arabia to this day.
In your work with Aramco, how much consideration is given to cybersecurity from like a transportation side of like actually shipping oil and the navigation systems on board those ships and other capabilities, vice to like on the production side in terms of like refineries and other cyber capabilities there?
So is there a focus on cybersecurity when dealing with shipping oil versus production? Now, at the time that I joined, Saudi Aramco had just sold what was the largest fleet of oil tankers in the world called Vela. However, it was also my job to monitor that particular shipping fleet in my office, and I was with a crisis team for any physical threats. We did have, shortly after I joined, an insider over in Saudi Arabia who was very peeved that he did not get the job he wanted to, so he put on Scribds some of our private communications channels, which was then used by a group to try to take over our boats, one of the boats, and we had to call out a team to physically take everything back. So I also did crisis management for that with a person who was from the Royal Navy who we had hired, who was Scottish, with the thickest Scottish accent I had ever heard in my entire life. So we had a large concentration on that because even though we did not own the ships themselves, it was integral for the logistics of the company to continue to make money. So we had a lot of concentration on that. And then also my background is I used to be a military aviator. And to this day, Aramco has the largest fleet of private aircraft. So we were very concerned about issues with our aircraft, where they were landing, the physical security of that side too as well. So we had a lot of concentration on that portion. And because the crown jewels of the company were with the ICS production portion, we had a lot of leeway with ICS vendors to say, you might not be offering this type of security to your regular customers, but we will not buy your products anymore unless you offer us additional stuff. Do you really want to lose the contract for the most valuable company in the world? No? Okay, thank you. You'll bend to our will. So that's what we did. Another question?
This is just sort of an aside. Did they ever figure out why he was trying to spread rumors about the ambassador, the British ambassador, I think it was? Like, what connection was there?
That was one of the weirdest ones because it didn't make any sense. The two people had zero relationship. They'd only maybe had been at one time, the ambassador had been on the board, the same board that she had been for a school in the UK that had been fined by something called Ofcom, which is like an educational thing there, for having very controversial textbooks. And then he got off the board, and then she got reassigned to something else.
The person who was doing the...
We have no idea. Yeah, we have no idea why. I think it was just an attempt to try to damage certain types of reputations. And it could have been because this person was a very ISIS-friendly person. He was an ISIS person. And the textbooks at the time were extremists. That's what the UK government ruled. That maybe there was some sort of something going on in his or her head to involve the doctor who had been involved with that particular school. But to this day, they weren't closely related at all, the two of them. They were not from the same family or the same branch, and they had no relationship. So it just appeared as though the perpetrator was trying to damage little bits and pieces of the reputation as much as possible. So it was very strange, to be honest with you. If the person was still alive, we could ask him. So, still got time for some questions?
I'll make it quick, sorry.
No, don't make it quick, 'cause we got about 8 minutes.
So the perpetrator working in the embassy, part of a very highly respected family. How did the family deal with the aftermath?
So how did the family deal with the aftermath? I have no idea. And I have no idea, to be honest with you. So that would have been something that was over in Saudi Arabia. So I don't know.
You mentioned you were a military aviator. Do you mind sharing what you flew?
So I was a military aviator. I was a C-5 Galaxy Loadmaster. That's the person who does the weight and balancing calculations of the largest aircraft in the military inventory. It's so big, it opens from the front and the back. The hydraulics will take it down completely, do this way and that way, and you can load other airplanes, tanks, and it's the only aircraft that can load the portable U.S. Army bridge that can go in there. I can even, or I once loaded up semi-trucks, several of them, inside my aircraft. And that particular duty, you're also the ground commander, and you also handle the physical security of the aircraft as well. We used to like to joke that we were typically assigned 3 guns on the aircraft, 1 for the flight engineer, 2 for each loadmaster, and there were by default 3 parachutes, and guess who's getting the parachute? Right? So that was a lot of fun, and it gave me a lot of good experience in avionics, airframe, and aeronautical engineering, and a lot of math. So I'm very, very good at math. And I can pack for 19 days with no check-in bags. Right? Bonus, right? Who said the military didn't give you any teachable skills as a civilian, right? So yes, yes.
So you've written 2 books. Do you think this will be a third?
Very possibly, very possibly, very maybe, because there's actually a lot more that went on, but this is only so long of a talk, and it was it was one of the oddest points in my entire life, because I never imagined I'd be sucked into all sorts of prayer bead, Turkish, teach me English lessons, hit list. Why am I being picked? I got spinach still in my mouth talking to the ambassador. So perhaps.
So if it was turned into a movie, who would you want to play you?
I don't know. Klaus. I'm not sure. So we still have 5 more minutes. 5 more minutes. I really can't tap dance. Do I continue a relationship with Aramco? At times I was contacted, I'm not sure if all of you are aware, but in April of this year, April or May, there was an unusual incident that happened on Aramco in Saudi Arabia. And there were 3 separate drone swarm attacks laden with explosives that took out strategically in 3 different areas of Saudi Arabia, causing ecological damage as well, and just blowing up stuff. What was interesting was at my office in The Hague, next door to us, which we were not in the embassy quarter, because we were in the business quarter, the Yemenis, Yemen government purchased with cash the building next to us. And we had no idea, but we had our suspicions where that money came from. And one day I'm talking to my boss, and I see a drone on the outside. And it was coming from the Yemeni embassy. What was interesting about that was the people who launched the drone attacks were Yemeni rebels who were being backed by the Iranian government. And those were our suspicions of who gave them the cash to buy. And unfortunately, we could not legally tell them that they could not try to surveil us and point drones at us. So we had to, at that time, because it was a separate incident, not related to this, actually had to get the diplomatic corps to speak to them as well, because that was a bit strange. You got a question?
Well, kind of. So for the role, I think you should have your own mastermind, bad guy in a James Bond movie role. I think you also want to mention how you can talk about these things and how they're not covered by your Aramco NDA anymore, just so people know.
Oh, well, this information wasn't classified. I also did not sign an NDA as well, but I only discussed certain things that I am permitted to discuss from the company, because obviously I would not want to run a relationship with them. So.
All right, and with that, we're going to wrap it. So let's give a round of applause.